The morning over Lincoln Square was clear and deceptively calm. The air was filled with the faint aroma of freshly baked buns from a nearby cafe, and the sun's rays played on the brass buttons of a guardsman's uniform. Jackson Clarence stood at the entrance to the historic building, motionless, like a marble statue. His tall, athletic silhouette cast a long shadow on the cobblestone square. Tourists, armed with smartphones and cameras, looked at him as if he were part of the decor. Some smiled, others whispered about how impressive his stoicism was, but Jackson was more than just a symbol. Over an 8-year military career, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and years working with army dogs, he had learned that stillness was not weakness, but strength honed by discipline. And yet, there was something strange about this day. At first, Jackson couldn't pinpoint the source of his unease. The crowd looked ordinary. Families with children, couples excitedly discussing their plans, and schoolchildren chattering nonstop. However, from this familiar hum, a rhythm emerged that disrupted the overall harmony. A rhythm that gradually grew louder, a low, guttural growl. His attention was drawn to a man emerging from the shadow of a nearby tree. He was a stocky man with short stubble and arms covered in faded tattoos. His gait was confident, almost aggressive, but the real threat came not from him. It emanated from the massive bulldog straining at the leash in front of him. The dog moved low, its muscles rippling under the short, tightly fitting fur, and its eyes stared intently at Jackson, as if he were the only object in its field of vision. The man stopped right in front of the crowd of tourists. He spoke loudly with emphasized contempt. "Look at him!" His voice echoed across the square, making some people turn around. Standing there all important, thinks his fancy uniform makes him special. The crowd began to slow down. Cameras previously aimed at the architecture, and Jackson now turned to the strange man. The murmur of conversations turned into tense whispers. Jackson remained motionless, but his gaze, hidden behind a perfectly aligned pose, carefully studied the intruder. The bulldog, which the man called Chesterton, continued to growl. Its teeth gleamed, and its powerful paws dug into the pavement, ready to pounce. But Jackson noticed something more. Through the mask of aggression, the dog seemed to be trying to say something. Each of its lunges was a kind of cry for help, its eyes occasionally darting between Jackson and its owner. It was a hostage in this scene, a pawn in the game its owner was orchestrating. "Easy, Chesterton," the man said, winking at the crowd. His voice was sickly sweet, which only emphasized the hidden threat. "We just want to say hello to the soldier, right?" At that moment, Jackson realized this was not a random incident. This man was here for a reason. He wasn't just looking for an audience. He craved power, craved to strip Jackson of his stoic calm. A young couple stepped back, the woman instinctively clutching her bag. A mother grabbed her son's hand and led him closer to the wall. An elderly gentleman with a baseball cap adorned with a veteran's pin frowned but did not intervene. The crowd began to tighten around them, forming an invisible arena. Jackson remained motionless, but his military experience told him the situation was rapidly escalating. His muscles were tense, like a coiled spring ready to unwind at any moment. Every detail on the square now seemed significant. The way the man jerked the leash, the movement of the children in the background, Chesterton's position in which instincts of aggression and submission battled. "Well, soldier," the man continued, his voice growing even louder, drawing the crowd in like a street performer. "Do you think you can stand still if Chesterton decides to test your patience?" Chesterton growled, and its powerful paws dug even deeper into the ground. Jackson knew the moment of truth was near. The crowd huddled closer, as if in an open-air theater where danger played the leading role. The spectators did not realize that they had become participants in the drama, not its witnesses. Their tense faces and darting glances filled the square with invisible electricity. Everyone understood. The next moment could turn from a game into a tragedy. Jackson Clarence stood like a rock, but inside him, another spectacle was unfolding. His consciousness broke down what was happening into its components. The positions of people, the trajectory of the dog's possible leap, the movements of its owner. Military training suggested the threat came not only from the beast. Chesterton was a tool. The real danger was the man who controlled this tool with frightening skill. Jackson noticed the smallest details. The way Walter Graves jerked the leash, first sharply to increase aggression, then loosening to give a false sense of freedom. His voice was calculated to provoke, to control, to capture attention. But behind this facade of aggression, Jackson saw cracks. Walter's dominance was superficial. Its source was not control, but a desperate need for it. "Chesterton," Walter barked, tugging the leash so hard the dog almost choked. "Show this guy who's boss." The dog's growl grew louder, but Jackson noticed something interesting. Chesterton's ears twitched, picking up the tone of the command, and its aggression momentarily weakened. The dog was not a machine. It reacted not only to orders, but also to the uncertainty that seeped through Walter's voice. The crowd, expecting Jackson to show some reaction, continued to watch him intently. But the guardsman did not move. His stillness was not a sign of fear, but an embodiment of discipline. He saw in Chesterton not an enemy, but a victim, trapped in the ambitions of others. The dog itself, despite its frightening behavior, reminded Jackson of the fighters he had met on the battlefield, those who were forced to fight not of their own volition. "Do you think your uniform makes you special?" Walter continued, his voice growing even louder, as if trying to convince not only those around him, but also himself. "Standing there like a statue, but inside you're just like everyone else, just a scared person hiding behind your medals." Jackson did not respond. His silence was his weapon. He knew that every sound, every reaction would be fuel for Walter. Instead, he focused on Chesterton. Each movement of the dog gave him more information. The sharp jerks of its tail, the barely perceptible tremor in its paws. Everything indicated that the dog did not want this confrontation. It was trained to obey fear, but did not understand what to do in the face of composure. "I see what you're doing, soldier," Walter sneered, his eyes gleaming with malice. "You think you can outsmart me, but do you know what makes Chesterton special? He senses weakness, and he'll bite it." Walter jerked the leash so hard that Chesterton almost fell. The crowd gasped, and one of the children quietly cried. A teacher standing nearby took a step forward, as if about to intervene, but stopped, noticing Walter's gaze. It was icy, full of hidden threat. Jackson did not move. His mind had already calculated several scenarios. He noticed that each of Walter's movements became less coordinated. His own aggression was beginning to control him. This was the key. "Do you think you've won?" Jackson spoke for the first time. His voice was low, calm, almost hypnotic. He was not speaking to Walter, but to Chesterton. "You're not like him. You're stronger." The dog froze. Its ears twitched slightly, and its growl weakened. Jackson knew he had just broken through the mask of aggression. His voice was calculated not for strength, but for understanding, and this shook Chesterton more than any of Walter's shouts. "What are you doing?" Walter narrowed his eyes, realizing he was losing control. His voice wavered. "This is my dog. You won't take her away." "I'm not taking anything away," Jackson replied, not taking his eyes off the dog. "I'm just giving her the chance to be who she should be." G.K. Chesterton stopped growling. Its powerful paws no longer slid across the stones in preparation for an attack. It looked at Jackson, its head tilted slightly, as if trying to understand who was in front of it. The crowd began to whisper. Someone started filming on their phone. The atmosphere on the square changed. People were no longer afraid. They watched the strange, almost mystical connection between the motionless guardsman and the massive dog. But Walter was not ready to give up. He took a step forward, jerking the leash with all his might. "Chesterton, get rid of this clown," he shouted, his voice filled with hysteria. The dog jerked but immediately stopped. Its gaze darted between Walter and Jackson. In that moment, everything became clear. Inside it, a battle raged between fear and trust, between learned aggression and its true nature. "You've lost control," Jackson said, looking straight into Walter's eyes. "Not over the dog, over yourself." These words were like the final blow of a hammer. Walter froze, his face contorted with a mix of anger and despair. Chesterton slowly sat down and then, to the crowd's amazement, lowered its head to the stones. Its growl turned into a deep, heavy sigh. In that moment, Walter's mask cracked. Jackson saw it in his eyes. This man had never had real power. Everything he knew was based on intimidation. Now that fear no longer worked, he was left with nothing. Jackson slowly knelt in front of the dog, extending his hand. "You're stronger than he thinks," he said softly. Chesterton, once a symbol of threat, now looked like a defeated, but not in battle, but in its inner conflict. It allowed Jackson to touch it, and this touch became the beginning of something new. The morning on Lincoln Square froze like a frame from a tense film. The crowd stood still in anticipation, as if each person realized something irreparable was about to happen. At the center of this living theater stood three figures: the motionless guardsman, Jackson Clarence, the agitated man with frayed nerves, Walter Graves, and the massive bulldog Chesterton, torn between its owner's commands and Jackson's calm. "Time's up, soldier," Walter said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. His fingers slowly slipped to the leash's clasp, the metal latch gleaming in the sunlight. "Now we'll see how brave you are." The crowd gasped as the sound of the unfastening carabiner cut through the air like a gunshot. Chesterton, freed, lunged forward. Its powerful paws struck the pavement, muscles tensed, ready to leap. Seconds stretched out like slow motion. People instinctively recoiled, some screamed, and children clung to their parents' hands. But Jackson did not move. His eyes remained fixed on Chesterton, studying every detail. He saw how the dog's powerful shoulders shifted slightly to the left, signaling readiness to pounce. He noticed how its ears twitched in the last fraction of a second, picking up something that contradicted its owner's commands. Chesterton's growl was loud, but there were notes of uncertainty in it, as if the beast itself did not believe what it was doing. When only centimeters remained before the impact, Jackson stepped forward. It was unexpected. The crowd froze. Instead of defending himself, the guardsman took a stance known only to those who worked with military dogs. His hands, gloved in white, moved with the precision of a surgeon. With his right hand, he grabbed Chesterton by the scruff of the neck, controlling its weight and momentum, and with his left hand, he pressed a point behind its shoulder blade, instantly taking the wind out of the dog. Chesterton did not fall but stopped moving. The guardsman carefully but firmly lowered it to the ground, using pressure on strategic points to avoid harm. The crowd, holding their breath, watched as the massive bulldog turned from a growling threat into a motionless beast under Jackson's hands. "Easy, boy," Jackson said, his voice low and soft. "This isn't your fault. You're just doing what you were taught." These words were addressed to the dog, but everyone on the square heard them. Chesterton, once the embodiment of aggression, now looked almost lost. Its breathing slowed, the growling disappeared, and its massive head bowed to the ground. It was not submitting, it was being freed from something it did not understand. Walter took a step back, his face contorted with rage. "No! This can't be! Chesterton, come here!" But the dog did not move. It just looked at Jackson and then at the crowd, as if seeking confirmation that its choice was right. Walter tried to approach, but the crowd closed in around him. Adults, children, elderly couples, all looked at him with the same expression: condemnation. He tried to shout something, to justify himself, but his words were drowned out by the murmur of the people. "You can't do this anymore," Jackson said, his voice calm but firm. "This is over." A police officer standing at the edge of the crowd approached. His uniform and badge attracted attention, and the crowd parted to let him through. "Everything's okay," Jackson said softly, handing the leash to the officer. "The dog is no longer a threat, but its owner is another matter." The officer nodded and gently took the leash. Chesterton went with him without the slightest resistance, but paused before leaving to give Jackson one last look. It was a look of gratitude that everyone who saw the scene understood. When the police took Walter away, his loud protests were drowned out by the crowd's applause. This was not just applause for a hero, it was applause for justice, restored after long minutes of tension. Walter Graves, now stripped of his former bravado, was led through the parting crowd to the waiting police car. His face was red with anger and humiliation, and his eyes darted around, as if searching for allies in the sea of people. But no one stood by his side. Instead, they looked at him with contempt and condemnation. the very emotions he had once used to intimidate others. The crowd, which had earlier seemed frightened and confused, now stood united. People stood shoulder to shoulder, creating an invisible barrier that Walter could not break through. His loud protests grew softer, turning into helpless grumbling. "This isn't fair," he shouted, trying to break free from the officers. "This is my dog. You have no right." The officer, a tall man with a stern expression, stopped and turned to him. His voice rang out loudly and clearly, making everyone fall silent. "This is not just your dog," he said. "This is an animal you turned into a weapon, and you will have to answer for that." Walter fell silent. His gaze darted to Jackson, who still stood in the center of the square like an unmoving figure. The guardsman looked straight at him, his eyes cold but filled with heavy disappointment. "You can blame anyone," Jackson said, his voice soft but heard by all. But the truth is, all of this is your own creation. You chose fear over respect, aggression over discipline, and now you're facing the consequences." Meanwhile, Chesterton stood next to the Animal Protection Service officer, a woman with graying hair and a confident smile. She gently stroked the dog's head, and it responded with a soft growl, more like a contented sigh. Its massive body was no longer tense, and its powerful paws stood firmly on the ground. This was no longer the dog that had lunged with a growl just minutes earlier. "Amazing," the woman said, addressing Jackson. "Its reaction to your actions shows that deep down, it still has the right instincts. This is evidence that it was originally trained to serve, not to attack." Jackson nodded, his gaze fixed on the dog. "It needs time," he said. "Time to forget what it was taught wrong and remember who it really is." Chesterton turned its head and looked at Jackson. In that gaze was something deep, a mix of gratitude and strange attachment that only those who have worked with dogs understand. It was not just the look of an animal, it was a farewell, but not forever. "We'll take care of it," the woman said, noticing the exchange of glances. "It has every chance to become what it should be." Jackson nodded but said nothing. His white gloves, still perfectly clean, lay along his sides, and his face remained as impassive as at the beginning of the scene. But something inside him had changed. He knew he had made the right choice, but this moment left a mark on his soul. The crowd did not disperse. People stood as if expecting something else important to happen. And it did. One of the parents, who had earlier hidden their child, stepped forward. "Thank you," he said, addressing Jackson. "You showed us what real strength means." These words were echoed by others. Someone clapped, someone shouted words of approval. The applause grew louder, echoing across the square. It was not just a gesture of gratitude. It was a recognition that they had witnessed something more significant than a mere incident. Jackson did not move until the applause died down. He was not a hero for recognition, but at that moment, he realized that his actions had left a mark on these people's hearts. Meanwhile, Walter Graves was seated in the police car. His shouts and protests no longer mattered. The police officer listed the charges: using an animal in a threatening manner, disturbing public order, animal cruelty. Each word rang out like a hammer blow, shattering his world. The crowd dispersed, leaving behind a whisper of conversations and the realization that this day had been a lesson not only for Walter, but for everyone. Jackson resumed his position. His motionless figure blended back into the square scenery, but now people perceived him differently. He was no longer just a symbol. He had become a person who proved that true strength lies not in intimidation, but in discipline, understanding, and respect. Lincoln Square returned to its usual rhythm. People took photos against the backdrop of architectural monuments. Children laughed, playing by the fountain, and tourists exchanged impressions, sipping coffee from paper cups. But now there was something else in the air. It was a sense of deep satisfaction, like after a well-ended performance in which good triumphed. Jackson Clarence stood at his post. His uniform was still impeccable, and his white gloves gleamed in the sunlight. His stillness was no longer perceived as part of a ceremony. Now everyone knew that behind this stoicism lay experience, strength, and compassion. A few people lingered nearby to look at the guardsmen who had changed their perception. Parents quietly explained to their children that this man was not just a soldier in a fancy uniform, but a real protector, A boy approached, holding his mom's hand. "Mom," he whispered, pointing at Jackson. "Is that the man who saved the dog?" "Yes," the woman replied with a warm smile. "He not only saved the dog, he showed what it means to be brave." Jackson heard them but gave no sign. His face remained calm, his gaze directed into the distance. However, inside he felt something new, a quiet pride that his actions had left such a mark. Somewhere beyond the square, Chesterton was beginning a new life. The Animal Protection Service officer took it to a rehabilitation center where specialists would work with it with care and understanding. Its aggressive past was not its choice, but Jackson knew this strong animal deserved a chance at a better future. He could imagine Chesterton undergoing new training, not through fear, but through respect. Perhaps one day this bulldog would work in the police force, help save lives, or even become a reliable companion for someone in need of its loyalty. A man in a sergeant's uniform approached Jackson. It was his direct superior, whose stern expression softened. "Excellent work, guardsman," he said quietly, so none of the tourists could hear. "You not only did your duty, you set an example." "Just use what I was taught, sir," Jackson replied, not turning his head. The sergeant nodded, his eyes lingering on Jackson's motionless figure. Sometimes, what we're taught is all we need to change the world, even if only for a day. He stepped away, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts. The sun rose higher, casting long shadows. Jackson stood as motionless as at the beginning of the day, but inside him reigned a different silence. It was not just discipline, but the realization that even small actions could influence someone's life. People continued to approach, sometimes stopping to take a photo, sometimes just watching. No one looked at him as a decoration anymore. They saw in him the person standing behind the tradition. As the crowd began to thin, someone shouted, "Thank you, sir." Jackson remained motionless, but inside he smiled. He knew he did not need applause or gratitude. He had done what he had to, and that was enough. On that day, not only Chesterton found its way to a new life. Everyone who witnessed the scene took away something more, a lesson about true power, compassion, and respect. True strength, as each person realized, came not from the ability to intimidate, but from the ability to remain calm and act with understanding. And this made the day, which had begun with a threat, a day no one would forget. Thus ended this story, leaving in the hearts of its participants a memory of how valor is shown not only in battle, but also in the ability to show mercy.